Welcome to Fight for Children's Ringside Roundtable podcast, where we discuss the power of sports to transform lives, and we don't back down from challenging topics or discussions. Our guests are industry leaders who step into the ring to take on some of the most pressing issues facing our youth today. We'll also discuss the role of sports and the sports industry in confronting and addressing them. I'm Keith Gordon, President and CEO of Fight for Children, and I'll be your host. Without further ado, let's step into the ring. So it brings up a really good question, which is, when you don't have access and when you have a dwindling population of kids actively participating, what happens? What are the effects, right? Because, Tom, you've spent a lot of time on this and a lot of the research with Aspen about the physical effects, but the social emotional effects and compounding this over time. And, you have a lot of really amazing graphics as well that show the compounding impact on our healthcare system over time, the cost to our economy, the cost to, our justice system, all these things that could potentially happen as a result of things that are really not available to kids that historically, even, for us around the table, we experienced as kids. Many of those opportunities just aren't there. So how do you sort of summarize in a way what happens when these things are gone?
I mean, the research is clear. Kids who are physically active are 1/10 as likely to be obese. They're more likely to stay in school. They're more likely to go to college. They're more likely to get better jobs coming out of college. They suffer a range of chronic diseases much less often than people who are not physically. 13 different types of cancer. Mental health is better. Girls who play sports are less likely to get pregnant. Drug use rates are lower. Binge drinking rates are higher for athletes, so it's not all good news. But most of the it's so clear. If we were to invent, if physical activity were a pill, we would the government would underwrite it in a significant way. So people understand this stuff, but we don't have the policy behind it. We don't support it in a significant kind of way. And then there's community cohesion. I mean, we live in a very polarized society right now where, Republicans don't play with Democrats and this grouping is very tribal. Well, sports is one of the few places still in our society where people come together and they play and get to know each other as human beings. As opposed to just political creatures that are over there. So we really miss by not really looking at the system and saying, how do we give every child an opportunity to play sports? I mean, the fundamental problem is the money. We've started to look at kids as a way to make money. No, kids at certainly up through age 12 or so, there needs to be this zone where we all invest in every child having an opportunity to play sports. And if that means we don't have second grade national championships in AAU, fine, get rid of them, create policies. We're not going to sanction you as an organization. We're not going to let you use public spaces to promote activity that creates an exclusionary sports system that pushes kids aside. There's a real cost to chasing the dollars at an early age, at the exclusion of child development and community development.
I mean, I think it's extremely well said. And I think when I think of my experience in youth sports, I almost think of youth sports as a basic service, right? A basic right. And the pandemic showed us one thing here in DC that, things that should be basic services for people like internet, Wi-Fi, and having the ability to access email and whatever else, these weren't things that were basic services. Food, shelter, clothing, water, and internet now is largely considered that. But if there are so many things that are dependent on kids being active and kids being socialized through sports, can we look at this as, the need to have, like you were saying, Tom, up until a certain age, a safe, constructive area where you can engage and you can, reap these benefits from that, that largely is unrecognizable today.
Well, this brings us back to the whole issue of even getting physical education in school and recess time in school. So kids even have an idea of what sport is. I'm doing some work in Saudi Arabia and different places in Middle East, and they don't have a lot of school sports. And so trying to, we've gone into schools asking them, would you like to play sport? And some of them don't even know what sport they'd like to play because they've never been introduced to it. They say, I'll say football because that's the only thing they know. That's soccer for them. And think, getting it right at the school level, at least introducing them to some sport. And then I love the DC Scores model where that after school activity is right there at the school because it's localized. Most people don't have transportation after school to go to these different fields, and beyond the money situation, it's a transport issue. So bringing it back to school, I'm in favor for.
So let me throw in something else too, because I think, access to safe spaces, access to quality programming are very much widely recognized issues. But another issue that is, it's inherent in almost every piece that I read, in particular coming from the Aspen Institute, is a lack of qualified, trained coaches and capable adults that have made a commitment to being, a consistent piece and a consistent factor in these programs. And so, Nyla, I'd pose the question to you. I mean, you made a very difficult decision. Maybe it wasn't so difficult, but you made a decision to change the trajectory of your life and focus on this industry. What is it about this industry that doesn't attract other people, both at the administrator level as well as the coach and the participant level?
I would say that it's not about not attracting people. People want to be involved in sports. It's really to what level. So, for example, to bring it back to your original example about the mom and pop shops, that is coming from a genuine place, wanting to create opportunities for their kids. But that longevity, that consistency ends when their kid ages out. So when that happens, you lose that continuity, you lose that, consistent presence in that activity, and it's detrimental to the rest of the kids. When it comes to coaches, this force to be competitive and you want to be the best and all of that makes people make some not so great decisions about who to bring into those coaching positions. You may have a track record, a history of winning, but if you're not pushing forth those educational pieces, the benefit, really looking after the whole well-being of the child. Yes, that's attracting a certain type of person to that industry, but that's not a good thing. The type of person you want to attract to this industry has to really be invested in the development of those kids. So I think there's definitely the number of people that are there. It's really about creating this space where we're putting forth the values and the emphasis on growing the child.
And is there also something to be said for a combination of both passion? Because there are a lot of people who run organizations that have passion, but they have no business savvy, right? And so you find great organizations with great people that don't last very long. One of the things that has been well documented about your time at Volo is that, you came in and you basically gave a lot of the sort of more formal business structure to an organization in order to help it scale. And it has been doing extremely well since then.
Yeah. So we're an interesting organization in that we came at it from the adult side, meaning that perspective is a business. It's straight up a business. The business exists because now adults kind of have trouble coming up with their own activities. They were scheduled to the T as a kid. They don't know how to get together. But it came from a business perspective. So when we looked at how do we create change in our communities, we were looking at how do we do this effectively, sustainably, but how do we scale it? We know everybody knows the positive impacts of youth sports, but how do we actually scale it to a way where we can make a measurable, significant difference in our communities? So we did have that aspect of, let's take the best of what some local organizations are doing. Let's not go in and compete. This isn't a silo situation where everybody's competing for competitive dollars. How do we amplify what organizations are doing well? And how do we step in when there are gaps? So an example, DC Scores, we've worked with DC Scores in DC. We've identified that they have a strong, they hold on the schools. They have a strong, program plan. We supplied coaches. We supplied volunteers to amplify their efforts. We supplied equipment. So really this idea of not it being a competitive space from a perspective of how does each organization become the player. It's really how do we collaborate to get to the end goal, which is getting as many kids active as we can.
And it seems like a very creative model too. For those of you who aren't familiar with Volo, in short, the more adults that sign up and pay, the more programs for kids will exist. And so it's a bit of a disruption in an otherwise very sort of stagnant area of this field.
Having the ability to know that Volo really has the backing up to a certain level allows the kids organization to really not have to compete for resources in a way that some organizations might feel that they need to. What we're able to do then is identify who are collaborative partners who share values and understand what the ultimate mission is around getting kids active. And we are on the kids side able to fundraise for programming, to support programming specifically.
So Lisa, I want to ask you, with a lot of the kids that you see coming through the programs, and obviously, you're responsible for sort of molding these individuals and then turning them out into the world to do whatever they want to do. You have a sort of more philanthropically inclined lens by which you approach your day job, right? And I think over time, we've started to see that a younger generation has a bit more of a social inclination, right? They're entrepreneurial, but they want to have, some sort of positive impact. And you have big brands on the environmental side, Patagonia, that's raising awareness through a lot of their actions. Are organizations like League Apps or Dick's or anybody else that's doing that they're putting forward small steps to do things to raise awareness or to raise money or to do things to sort of generate a little bit more of let's call it an attractive area where people could kind of go into and feel like the philanthropic drive is not something that can be necessarily cannibalized by the opportunity to make a buck.
And this is where I go back to social enterprise. Basically, that's what Volo is. They're commercializing their adult league in order to benefit the youth and make it free. But coming back to corporations, now that people seem to be having more flexibility and work from home, that could open up time for more parents and executives to be on the field. Before, we spent that hour and a half commuting or, in the office, and we couldn't be home in time for that 4 or 5 o'clock practice. So if corporations, which they do right now, give their employees time off to go build a school or pay, for some community good, maybe they should be, offering comp time for their employees to go coach. But make sure that they get some training. Let's not throw them out there and just say, go coach, because we all know it sounds easy, but when you get into it, it's a little bit more difficult. And the number one thing that friends of mine who coach and also referee, it's the parents. They love the kids, they love the activity, but they don't want to deal with the parents telling them, well, my son needs more time. And, I think you should be doing it this way. Or the ref getting yelled at for, refereeing a second grader. So this is all needs to be taken into consideration.
Well, at a very high level, as we want to roll some of this stuff up, I mean, it's always interesting because there are a lot of opinions out there about what could be done, right? What can we do to sort of save youth sports, to take back control of it? And, I wanted to pose the question to all three of you, if there were no bad ideas and no restrictions, right? What are some ideas that have gained some traction with each of you individually? I mean, Tom, why don't we start with you? Because I know, again, in Linda Flanagan's book, Take Back the Game, she spends a good amount of time about talking about what can be done specifically to wrestle back control. And some of these ideas are fairly extreme, posed by some sociologists. And obviously, you have an opinion on that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there are several things that could be done. One would be for schools to rethink the model for how they provide sports. We have kind of fallen into this mode where, like at the high school level, it's all about interscholastic sports. And we know that only 39% of high school students play sports. But, there's all sorts of organizations in a community that could provide sport experiences for kids. And some of them are highly competitive and others are just fitness based. A lot of kids just want yoga or strength training or biking or climbing or whatever it is. So how can schools, not just provide sport experiences for the kids who try out for these interscholastic teams, and kids who make it are the best athletes, and or have been trained up for years through the clubs. But like, look at every student. If sport is valuable in helping a child in any number of ways, including academically and educationally, how can we more intentionally work with a child and either provide or connect them to experiences in their community? So there's huge opportunity there. And at the younger level, and even really up through age 17, getting very clear on the minimum conditions under which children should be engaged in sports. We created something last year. We drafted this document. It's called the Children's Bill of Rights in Sports, with the help of sports policy leaders, with human rights leaders. We looked at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. We look at what Norway did. They put a Children's Bill of Rights at the core of the model that I think is the best sport system in the world.
Right.
They kill everybody in the Olympics, and they also have so many kids playing sports.
Right.
But
and you're not alone there. There's a lot of people who have cited Norway as an example for us to follow.
Yeah, no, they've got it, and it's about coaching too. I mean, getting more coaches into the system, more women, more young people, et cetera. But it's also lifting the quality of the coaches, and it's a real challenge in this country because, there aren't too many people paid to be coaching. We just hired somebody who joined us this week. Name is Dr. Vince Minharis, and he is one of the few people I know who has a doctorate in coaching. So understanding the pedagogy of how to actually coach effectively. And we don't in this country, we don't fully understand that. And then we're reluctant to ask this largely volunteer base to adhere to those principles. So it's a very sticky problem. It's a very challenging thing, but but I'd like to believe that all these parents who are coaching kids want to be effective. They want to have a real positive impact on the lives of kids. So how can we get them trained or better educated on how to be effective as coaches? What incentives can we put in place as corporations, or from a government perspective, or from a national governing body perspective that encourages and rewards coaches for learning the type of skills that would make it a better experience for kids?
I totally agree with you, Tom. And it's interesting, as I mentioned earlier, I coach my daughter's soccer, out here in McLean where we live. And every year I have to take the Safe Sport training course. And in addition to the responsibility of being a coach, just from a time perspective and, the diligence, it's always good to be reminded of the responsibility you have, when you are a person of authority in the lives of other impressionable kids. And, the things that you will have to go through just to be certified every year, it sort of further authenticates the importance of that role. And I think if my personal opinion is, if you literally made that role a role of prominence other than being a weekend volunteer, you could see a lot of different outcomes in youth sports.
It is interesting that you're saying that this is a $19 billion officially, but more likely $30 billion industry. But these organizations do rely very heavily on volunteers, and coaches who do coach aren't necessarily paid very well. So where's that money going is kind of the one question. And is it going to educate? Is it going to incentivize coaches who have track records of winning as opposed to coaches who have track records of developing? The other thing that you said that I just wanted to tap into was this idea that, great, like, let's get schools to be more of that center around that. But there is such a big gap between what the research shows and the policy changes that need to be made and what actually happens on the field, that might be a good long-term solution. Short-term, there's got to be more of an active role that companies and private industry need to be able to step in to kind of fill that gap in the time being. Things like the models where, great, you have these complexes who are making $1 million in a tournament. What's their responsibility to the community to give back? Are they also providing a free version for the kids who aren't able to participate? There has to be some sort of other side to that coin. There is money there. Where is it going?
I mean, it seems this notion of having a federal agency to have oversight, of all sports top down, not necessarily to prevent people from playing or competing, but to have a little bit more of a, an egalitarian approach when you offer one, you have to offer the other. I mean, these things don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? They can coexist. You can still have competition-based sports, and you can still have a lot of, competitive organizations and tournaments, but you really don't want that to happen necessarily at the expense of access to these basic services, as I was calling it.
I go back to localized and fun. Let's find that park, a safe space near where people are living. And, the problem is who in that community is going to be spearheading that initiative to put sports programming in that safe space. And that's where is it the local city council? Is it the health department? Who is going to take that initiative? Because there's spaces that go unused, and we need to be smarter about identifying and then repurposing those spaces for youth to participate. And, I'm not Catholic, but the Catholic Youth Sports Organization is interesting because it's a community, and they allow for competition, because what I'm seeing in some of the places abroad is they're now starting these sports clubs or sports program, but the kids aren't competing against other kids. So they come and train, and they're like, well, I'm done training. I want to see how I'm doing against others. And I think you do need to have some sort of, if it is localized, they just can't come to their local park and play by themselves. They are going to need to play with other localized groups. And so that's just my wish list.
Yeah, I'm sure there are spaces that are not being used right now, but what we often have are spaces that are highly coveted. So school gyms, fields at the school, park and rec facilities. And I think that's a real opportunity to drive both access and quality. Instead of park and recs and the schools just saying, okay, show us that you have insurance. Show us that your coaches are background checked, that they're trained and or educated in certain key competencies, that you have access provisions. Maybe you give discounts to organizations that have, if the 30% of the kids in the community are free and reduced lunch, well, communities that reflect that type of diversity, economic diversity, get preferred access or preferred rates. There's a way to use the what people want, the supply, the limited supply of coveted space to again drive access and quality, I think.
And maybe even again with the right motivation, this is where maybe you can leverage or provide incentives to people who do have the means to always be thinking about, providing something to those who don't. And again, you can probably find a number of examples, both in the research that you've done, Tom, as well as some of the business case studies that you've done, Lisa. But businesses that, consider, if businesses look at underserved populations and think it's a bad investment because they can't turn a profit, I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, right? And if we could flip that script a little bit to say, there's a way to be a responsible, profitable business while making sure that you have a community lens that is front and center. And I think we're in a period right now where these conversations are actually bubbling to the top, in the sort of age of DE&I and inclusion. I mean, these are the times to have these conversations. And these are the conversations that I think are happening in almost every boardroom around the country.
Well, it's all about how do you incentivize that behavior. So what we've tried to do, we've recognized that there aren't often coaches, like it's the middle of the day, it's a little harder. So what we do is we say that adults, if you volunteer with our kids, you get to play for free in our leagues. So you go through the training, you go through the background check, all of that. But it's another incentive that we're trying to say, listen, we see a need. We have the ability to incentivize positive behavior. Let's look at it with that lens. If we could get organizations, if we could get local government institutions to incentivize that kind of behavior through additional access, through money obviously is always at the root here. It's about rallying around what we're trying to incentivize, and I think that's the key.
Or corporations. Recognizing
exactly.
the time that parents are spending.
Exactly.
And corporations should pay attention. I love the Volo model. They just need to go watch why Volo has grown so much. adults want to have fun. They want to have a social experience. They want a low pressure experience. They want something that fits into their schedule that isn't gobbling up the entire year. So if adults want that, why aren't we creating that kind of environment for kids? Why do we have the kids in a professionalized grinder experience at an early age? I mean, as an adult, think about what you want out of a sport experience, and then foster the kind of environment that.
But the problem is many parents, are that couch quarterback, right? Well, I know my son can do this and get a scholarship because maybe they didn't get a scholarship. So it's kind of interesting. I think they reflect back. So.
Well, I think it's a good place to move into our conclusion here. And what I'd like to be able to do is, just in terms of closing thoughts, if you could go around, one thing that gives you a sense of optimism as we look ahead for the industry. Lisa, why don't you go ahead and start?
Well, we've seen a demand for sports coming out of this COVID. I mean, everybody missed it. And I think, we're not quite back to 2019 levels, but we are moving forward. And globally, I've seen more people recognizing the importance of sport, and in developing countries, they're trying to get their youth to participate in sports.
That's great. Tom?
I was paying attention to my phone going off. I'm so sorry about that.
It's all right.
What was the question, Keith?
Well, so Tom, just one thing that gives you a sense of optimism from where we are today to where we think we could probably go, as it relates to sports and, getting control back of some equity and some access for all.
I mean, I think people appreciate now to a much greater degree that sport is not just sport, that it is catalytic to building healthy lives and healthy communities. We've seen the research, heads nod, policymakers, everybody gets it now. The next stage is just creating the incentives, the policies, the mandates that support that. And so can the healthcare industry start to not just focus so much on sick care, but actually focus on preventive care and begin to think of sport as a tool in that way. So I think it's there. It's there for the taking. It's just going to take some leadership.
Yeah, well said. Nyla?
I mean, I think you're starting to see it with consumers and where they're putting their dollars. They're starting to put their dollars towards organizations and towards companies that do kind of align with their mission. So while policy change is great and ultimately what needs to happen, in order to get there, it's not just voting at the poll booth. You're kind of voting with your dollars. You're lifting up organizations who are doing things that are good for their communities. And you're seeing that more now than we have in the past. And I think that's a good trajectory. I don't think it's going to solve the problem because you still do need to make those big decisions. But I think, to me, that's showing that there is hope and that we're trying to move in the right direction on an individual level.
Well, that's great. I think all of you guys have great perspectives. I can't thank you enough for being a part of our discussion.
No, I just said with the increase in mental health challenges that so many youth and adults are having, it is so important for people to turn beyond a pill to the sports and get people active. So that's my encouragement for everybody to think, don't look at medication, always look at physical activity.
It's a very, very good point. And again, if for those of you who are interested in learning a little bit more, there is a plethora of information that's out there, thanks to Tom and his team at the Aspen Institute, that will give you as much information as possible about the benefits of sports and some of the statistics that he shared earlier. I want to thank all our guest panelists for being part of this discussion. I could literally have this discussion for another hour, but I want to be sensitive to your time, and thank you so much. Nyla Batista with Volo Sports, Lisa Delpi Narati with George Washington University, and of course, Tom Ferry with the Aspen Institute. Thank you all. Before we wrap up, I do want to thank our friends at the Kimsey Foundation, whose primary focus is emphasizing educational and cultural initiatives and building enduring livable communities that offer hope and opportunity to youth. We're grateful for their support, and of course, without which this podcast would not be possible. So from all of us at Fight for Children, thank you for tuning in to the Ringside Roundtable, and we look forward to our next conversation.